Secretary of State Rex W. Tillerson on Wednesday. When asked if he had called the president a moron, he bristled, "This is what I don't understand about Washington. When McNameeGetty Images Pettiness, such pettiness, in this noxious swamp of maybe morons, I'm not going to deal with petty stuff like that," Secretary of State Rex W. Tillerson told reporters on Wednesday, declining to refute an NBC report that he had privately called President Trump a moron this year. "This is what I don't understand about Washington. Again, I'm not from this place. But the places I come from, we don't deal with that kind of petty nonsense." There was no immediate estimate available for the collective pettiness of Texas, where Mr. Tillerson was raised, nor of the oil industry, where he spent his career, until Mr. Trump summoned him to the pettiness hub along the Potomac. But for a certain class of Washington denizen, Mr. Tillerson's slight opened a new front in the nation's forever war against the reputation of its capital. The thrashing of Washington culture by voters, non-voters, members of Congress, that much is a sacred right. A sitting Secretary of State, at odds with his president and blaming the city's trifling instincts for stoking tensions, is another matter. "It's profoundly paradoxical," said Rick Tyler, a longtime Republican strategist who served as communications director for Senator Ted Cruz of Texas during last year's Republican presidential primary race. His boss is the most petty person ever to come to Washington. Barney Frank, the retired longtime Democratic congressman from Massachusetts, marveled at how wholly a sitting government in Washington had embraced a view of Washington villainy. "You expect this from Congress, not the executive," he said, noting that such open policy fissures within a White House were also something new. It used to be considered wrong for the opposition party to differ with the president sharply on foreign policy. Now it's not the opposition party that's differing from the president on foreign policy, it's the Secretary of State. In his remarks, Mr. Tillerson was vigilant in treating certain non-moron details with due care. He explicitly denied, for instance, that he has ever considered resigning his post, as NBC reported, much less that Vice President Mike Pence had been compelled to persuade him to stay. "One team with one mission," he said of the Trump executive branch. But few would contest that the relationship between a president and his top employees is a subject of non-trivial global significance. So too, for that matter, is the question of whether the president is a moron. A State Department spokeswoman, Heather Nauert, later insisted that Mr. Tillerson had not used that language. The noun at issue on Wednesday is also no novelty in the Trump administration. Gary D. Cohn, the president's top economic advisor, joked to a group of Senate Democrats this year that only morons pay the estate tax, according to people present at the meeting. And Mr. Trump himself has let fly the word with considerable frequency. His Twitter account has referenced moron or some variation thereof more than 50 times since 2012, according to an archive of his handiwork. Some are repurposed comments from little-known users. Some are Trump-branded fusillades at political foes like Karl Rove and George F. Will. Others are Trump-branded fusillades aimed at little-known users. "Why do you follow me like a little puppy, moron?" the future president asked in 2013 of At9Tech, who had assured Mr. Trump, profanely, that no intelligent people cared for his thoughts about sharks. 4 years later, the stakes have been elevated some. Mr. Trump has openly undercut his aides as a matter of course, with deliberations that often play out in public view. Mr. Tillerson has appeared uniquely vulnerable to such indignities, eclipsed at times by Nikki Haley, the ambassador to the United Nations, and even by the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who was tasked with forging a peace deal in the Middle East. Mr. Tillerson's policy aims have also been contradicted repeatedly by Mr. Trump. Most recently, when Mr. Tillerson said he was seeking to open lines of communication with North Korea, Mr. Trump told Mr. Tillerson and some 40 million Twitter followers that the secretary was wasting his time trying to negotiate with Little Rocket Man, Mr. Trump's pejorative nickname for Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader. Mr. Tyler appraised Mr. Tillerson as the most abused cabinet member that Trump has, adding that the competition was considerable. But Mr. Tillerson has exacted a measure of retribution against Mr. Trump, intentionally or not, during his tenure, distancing himself from the president's equivocal statements about white supremacists after violent demonstrations in August in Charlottesville, VA. "The president speaks for himself," Mr. Tillerson said then, declining to affirm that Mr. Trump's words represented American values. By the end of Wednesday, whether or not Mr. Tillerson tacitly admitted to calling Mr. Trump a moron, there was at least bipartisan consensus on this much. The stability of a relationship between the president and his Secretary of State probably matters. "It's not helpful to the country to have this kind of thing going on," said Thomas M. Davis III, a former Republican congressman from Virginia, who noted that while there is pettiness everywhere in Washington, it's a blood sport. The Secretary of State calling the president he or she works for a moron is not a petty point, said Dan Pfeiffer, a former senior advisor to President Barack Obama. "It's big news. Of course, they would say that. They have worked in Washington.